Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Today we're diving into some major political and legal stories that are shaking up the headlines. You won't want to miss what we have in store. So let's get right into it. Alright, let's talk about what we are actually looking at here, because this is not just another Trump headline, not just another he posted, they clapped, liberals mad, conservatives raging kind of story. What you just laid out is something much bigger. It's the moment where the myth of Donald Trump as untouchable billionaire, genius dealmaker, and permanent Teflon figure runs headfirst into the hard wall of legal and financial reality. And that collision is loud, it's messy, and it's happening in real time, on camera, in front of federal marshals, appraisers, and a judge who basically took his legal arguments, shredded them, and set the pieces on fire in a written opinion. So imagine this as an opening shot, because this is how you'd frame it if this were a documentary. Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, the gold-tinted glass of Trump Tower in the background. Not as a backdrop for a campaign announcement, not as a stage for The Apprentice, but as a crime scene for financial misconduct. Federal marshals, state attorneys, and court-appointed receivers walking through those revolving doors with clipboards and court orders, not as guests, but as the beginning of the end. The same building that Trump used for decades to signal wealth, power, and dominance is now a backdrop for enforcement. That is the symbolic core of what you're describing. For half a century, Trump's strategy has been inflate the image, inflate the number, inflate the story. Today, the story is being deflated in real time, and the people holding the needle are not political opponents. They're judges, marshals, and the financial markets themselves. Let's start with the legal posture, because if you zoom in on the ruling itself, what the judge did here is not just deny emotion. She drew a line in judicial ink and basically said, enough. Trump went into court claiming that seizing his assets would cause irreparable harm, that enforcing the judgment before his appeal was resolved was a due process violation, that the entire case was political persecution driven by an attorney general who campaigned on going after him. You can hear the familiar soundtrack, witch hunt, deep state, weaponized law. But this time, instead of that narrative driving the coverage, you've got a judge calling those arguments frivolous, legally meritless, and insulting to the integrity of the court. That kind of language is rare. Judges don't usually talk like Twitter. When a judge steps out of the usual cautious, neutral voice and starts calling your arguments bad faith and corrosive to public trust, that is a 5-alarm fire for your legal strategy. And the core of the judge's reasoning cuts right through all the spin. You were found liable for fraud after a full trial. You had lawyers, you had discovery, you cross-examined witnesses. You presented your own witnesses. You lost. A massive judgment was entered. New York law says if you want to appeal and pause enforcement, you post a bond. That's it. That's the rule for everyone, not just Donald Trump, not just politically sensitive defendants. Everyone. If you can't secure a bond, the judgment gets enforced. Your buildings become collateral in the most brutal way possible, not through a flashy loan, but through state-supervised seizure. Now here's where it gets deliciously, brutally ironic. The entire fraud case is about Trump inflating his asset values to banks and insurers. He tells lenders one thing, tax authorities another. Penthouse 3 times the actual size. Mar-a-Lago valued like it's a kingdom. Properties magically expanding and contracting in value depending on what Trump needed in the moment. The judge calls it persistent, long-running fraud. Decades of it. So what happens when that same man has to go out into the real world and say, hey, I need someone to underwrite a $500 million appeal bond, and by the way, here are the valuations I'd like you to accept. Suddenly the magic stops working. More than 30 surety companies basically gave his team the same answer. We don't buy the numbers. The market, without any ideology, without any cable news spin, looks at his books and says, nope. And that's the part that really matters. The market has, in effect, co-signed the judge's fraud finding. If his assets were really worth what he claims on Truth Social or on stage at a rally, securing a bond would have been painful, but straightforward. Billionaires don't usually have to watch marshals inventory their lobby fixtures. They call a bank, they post collateral, everyone gets paid, and they fight the appeal from a position of security. That didn't happen here. Why? Because when the fraud case stripped away the inflated numbers and forced a reckoning, bankers, who live and die by risk, wanted no part in betting hundreds of millions on Trump's self-reported valuations. So let's talk about the irreparable harm argument Trump's lawyers tried to sell. They told the judge, if you let enforcement go forward and we ultimately win on appeal, the damage will be done. The properties will be sold. The empire will be dismantled. You can almost hear the violins, but the judge's response was basically, that's what the bond requirement is for. You don't want your stuff touched? You put up security. You don't have to like it, but that's the system. And if you can't meet the bar, that's not a constitutional crisis. That's your bank account and your balance sheet catching up with your storytelling. The judge went further. Any harm Trump suffers from enforcement is self-inflicted. He didn't have to commit fraud. He didn't have to default on honesty. He didn't have to stretch the truth until it snapped. And after he did all that, he could have arranged his finances to be able to post a bond. He didn't. That's not persecution. That's consequence. Now zoom out. This is not just a story about one ruling or 3 buildings. This is the culmination of a lifelong pattern. The content you gave walks through it. The contractors who did work for him and then watched him dodge payment. The lawsuits that dragged on for years until small businesses folded or settled for pennies on the dollar. The logic has always been the same. Make litigation more expensive for your opponent than giving up. Use delay as a weapon. Turn process into punishment. That's the story of Trump as a businessman, long before Trump as president. It's not that he hates lawsuits, he weaponizes them. But that playbook looks very different when the person on the other side of the table is a state attorney general or a court system with deep pockets and institutional patience. You can't starve the state of New York into a settlement the way you can a small drywall company. You can't outspend the legal system when the legal system has staff, resources, and a duty to keep going, whether you scream on social media or not. For the first time, Trump is discovering what happens when he tries to run the old scam on an opponent who cannot be bullied, bankrupted, or worn down with time. The E. Jean Carroll cases, the classified documents case, the January 6th investigations. You see the same pattern you see here in the fraud ruling. Deny the conduct, attack the accuser, claim persecution, refuse to comply, lose in court, claim persecution again, appeal everything, stall, stall, stall. With Carroll he loses, then repeats the defamation, then loses bigger. With classified documents, he resists subpoenas, lies about what he has, forces a search warrant, then calls the FBI Gestapo. With January 6th, he hides behind executive privilege he doesn't have, claims absolute immunity no court has ever recognized, and insists every effort to hold him accountable is election interference. It's the same script every time, but in this fraud case, the script is colliding with a very simple mechanic. Civil judgments get enforced. You don't pay, they take. And that's what makes the imagery here so potent. Marshals walking into 40 Wall Street, appraisers at Seven Springs taking measurements, running valuations, preparing for the possibility that this thing ends in a sale. Legal professionals in Trump Tower, not to attend a launch party, but to assess whether and how to liquidate pieces of the building itself. The brand is being treated not as aura, not as myth, but as an asset line item. The Trump name on the front of the building doesn't shield it from becoming just another property in a court-ordered sale. Politically, this is radioactive. Trump's entire political persona is built on 3 pillars. I'm rich, I'm a winner, and I understand the system better than anyone, so I can game it for you. Only I can fix it was never just about policy. It was about the promise that he knows leverage, he knows power, and he always comes out on top. When voters in 2016 shrugged at the Access Hollywood tape or the scandals, a big part of the rationalization was, yeah, but he's a real businessman. He's not like these career politicians. He knows deals. That's what made him different in the eyes of many of his supporters. Now, in front of the entire country, that core pitch is being demolished not by a political opponent, but by balance sheets and a judge's opinion. Think about what it means when you tell your supporters for decades that you're worth billions, that everything you touch turns into gold, and then when the legal system presents you with a bill, you can't come up with a bond. The contradiction writes itself. How do you square, I'm a financial genius, with, I cannot secure financing to stop them from taking my properties? How do you keep running on, the system is rigged against me, when the evidence shows you rigged your own books for years and the only reason the state is stepping in is because you lost and didn't pay. Now let's talk about the MAGA reaction, because the content you gave nails something important. This is splitting Trump world in a way that's deeper than the usual grumbling. On one side, you have the Bannon wing, full-blown escalation, no breaks, no nuance. Surround Trump Tower, block the marshals, treat this as a clarion call for a populist uprising. They frame asset seizure as the moment the so-called deep state unveils its true face. To them, this is 1776, not a civil enforcement action. And for that wing, the goal is not to win in court. The goal is to delegitimize the very idea that the court has authority over Trump in the first place. On another side, you have the more quietly panicked Republican strategists, donors, and former officials. They're not going to go on cable news and say, yeah, he looks broken cornered. But they are absolutely doing that math behind the scenes. Because his brand is now a liability, not just for him, but for the party that hitched itself to his image as a titan of industry. They see the headlines: Trump fails to secure bond, Trump properties inventoried for seizure, judge calls arguments frivolous. They aren't hearing witch hunt, they're hearing anchor. Not just dragging down his own future, but potentially dragging down House and Senate races. You don't want your presumptive nominee on the front page next to words like seizure, fraud judgment, and insolvency vibes. Then you've got the third camp, the squirming middle, Fox News pundits and GOP politicians who want to say, this feels unfair, without fully swallowing the conspiracy theory Kool-Aid. So they start saying things like, look, I think Letitia James is politically motivated, but maybe Trump should have handled this differently. Or, I don't love seeing a former president's properties seized, but the law is the law. That fence sitting becomes harder to maintain once the visuals kick in, once you really have footage of marshals entering Trump Tower with court orders. At some point, you either have to call for confrontation or admit out loud that a court finding of fraud might actually mean something. Meanwhile, Trump is doing what he always does, going online, smashing the caps lock, calling the judge corrupt, calling the attorney general a hack, insisting this is all a preview of what Democrats want to do to every conservative in America. The message is, this isn't about me, it's about you. I'm just the first target. The problem is that this narrative depends on people not understanding or not caring that the underlying case is about years of documented, proven financial misrepresentation. It counts on people seeing only the enforcement and not the fraud. But as the content you gave points out, the fact pattern is stubborn. Multiple properties, inflated values, trial, verdict, judgment, failed bond search, now enforcement. That chain is hard to reduce to, they just hate my politics. Now, the systemic implication here is huge, and this is where the analysis really matters beyond Trump as an individual. Because you're right. This is a test of whether powerful people, especially those with political followings, can be held to the same civil enforcement mechanisms as everyone else. If Trump had won this round, if he had somehow convinced a court that the bond rules shouldn't apply to him, or that his assets couldn't be touched because of his political prominence, that would have been catastrophic for the principle of equal application of the law. You'd essentially be creating a special class of litigant who can scream witch hunt and escape enforcement. Instead, this ruling says the opposite. It says, you can be a former president, you can have a massive following, you can be on television every night, you can run for office again. None of that immunizes you from the boring, grinding machinery of civil law. Commit fraud, lose the case, fail to post a bond, you get treated like any other judgment debtor. That's what rule of law is supposed to mean. Not that the law is perfect or apolitical, but that the basic mechanics are not supposed to warp simply because enforcing them against a famous person will create headlines. And there's a subtle but important detail in the judge's language that the content you shared brings out. She doesn't just reject the persecution argument, she labels it as corrosive. She basically says, these claims don't just fail in court, they actively undermine public trust in the judiciary. That's a warning shot, not just to Trump, but to every lawyer and politician who thinks they can turn every adverse ruling into a campaign slogan. Courts aren't built to withstand endless bad faith attacks from defendants who weaponize victimhood as a shield against accountability. By calling that out, the judge is trying to close the door on a tactic that has been metastasizing across the political right. The idea that any legal consequence must by definition be illegitimate if it lands on one of our people. From a financial system perspective, this is also devastating. When financial analysts look at a portfolio like Trump's, they don't just see buildings, they see leverage, debt, covenants, risk exposure. If flagship properties like 40 Wall or Trump Tower start getting encumbered or seized, lenders on other properties are going to start asking very hard questions. Loan agreements often have clauses that let banks accelerate debt if a borrower suffers certain kinds of legal or financial shocks. A big civil fraud judgment and active enforcement can absolutely qualify. That's how you get from they might take one or two buildings to is the whole organization in danger of a cascading crisis. Pretty quickly, this stops being about New York versus Trump and becomes a domino effect where private lenders act to protect themselves, possibly triggering a broader unwinding of the Trump organization. Politically, this all bleeds into the 2024 narrative in ways that are incredibly dangerous for Trump. Every campaign ad that wants to hit his business genius persona now has B-roll waiting. Marshals at the doors, appraisers at the gates, headlines about a fraud judgment in the hundreds of millions, quotes from a judge calling his arguments frivolous and bad faith. You can already hear the voiceover. He said he was a billionaire. He said he was a deal maker. But when the bill came due, it's one thing to argue over policy. It's another thing entirely to tell voters. This man's entire brand was built on lies about money, and now the courts and markets have proved it. Will his base care? Probably not. The hardcore MAGA base has already decided that any negative story about Trump is either fake, biased, or a badge of honor. For them, the more the system goes after him, the more righteous he appears. But elections aren't won solely on the backs of the hardcore. They're won on the margins. Suburban voters, soft Republicans, low information independents who bought into the Trump persona more than the ideology. Those voters might not be glued to every legal filing, but they understand what it means when a person who calls himself a billionaire can't pay his judgment and loses his buildings. And then there's the legitimacy question. How does this reshape Americans' view of the justice system? For years, people have watched wealthy executives skate by on technicalities, settlements, and non-admission consent decrees. The sense that there's a separate track for the rich is not paranoia. It's been reality. So when a former president and self-proclaimed billionaire actually faces real enforcement, it sends a different message. Sometimes the system actually does push back. Sometimes the paper tiger has teeth. That doesn't fix everything. It doesn't make the system suddenly fair and equal. But it does puncture the idea that power always buys immunity. What you've laid out here is not just a description of events. It's a portrait of a reckoning, a financial reckoning, a legal reckoning, and a narrative reckoning. Trump built an entire career and then a presidency on the claim that he was bigger than the institutions around him, smarter than the people enforcing the rules, and uniquely capable of bending reality to his will. The Letitia James fraud case, the Engoron ruling, and this bond fiasco say otherwise. They say, no, you're subject to the same formulas, the same statutes, the same enforcement mechanisms as the contractors you stiffed and the borrowers you mocked. And here's the kicker, the part that really underlines the stakes you mention at the end. If Trump somehow manages to wriggle out of this, if through delay, political pressure, or some last-minute backroom miracle, he avoids the full enforcement of this judgment, then a very dangerous lesson gets broadcast. That even when you're caught, even when a court finds fraud, even when the market won't back your numbers, you can still escape the consequences if you are loud enough and powerful enough. That would send a signal to every future Trump, every aspiring fraudster with political ambitions, that the path is still open. Lie, inflate, cheat, run for office, and if the law comes for you, turn your followers against the system until it backs off. But if the process plays out, if the assets really are seized, if the bond never materializes, if Trump actually loses major pieces of his empire to satisfy this judgment, it will stand as a very different symbol that even a former president, even a man who branded himself as the ultimate winner, can be dragged back down to reality by numbers that don't add up and a legal system that, at least this time, refused to blink. So, as this continues, and it will continue, with appeals, with hearings, with more truth social meltdowns. The key thing to watch isn't just the legal filings. It's the visuals, the splits inside MAGA, the reaction of financial institutions, the tone of judges who are increasingly done with the game. Because this isn't just about whether Trump keeps a skyscraper. It's about whether the story he told America about himself survives contact with the truth. And right now, as federal marshals walk through those doors and appraisers take their measurements, that story is crumbling, brick by brick, valuation by valuation, excuse by excuse.